I'm Charlie Wilson, for those who don't know me. I've lived here 30 years, close. And love the place, and history's always been I'm not a historian, but professionally, but I have a big interest in history and interest in where I live. And so I've been, studying this and reading about it for quite a while, and I'll share some of what I know or think I know with you. So we're going to start here. I'd like to do this chronologically because that's kind of I certainly use that. I'm a linear thinker, and I like to move chronologically because that's the way things make sense to me. To do that perfectly, I'd have to bounce you back and forth. So I'll pull you out of a timeline occasionally just to cover something so we don't have to walk back and look at it. But we're going to start right here, which is kind of where Taftsville started. And I'll ask you to go back 225 years with me to 1793. And back then, there was next to nothing here, people-wise. This was, you could think of this as the frontier. I mean, Woodstock existed, and it was a small little village, and there were some villages scattered around. In between, pretty much nothing. And if you think about it, Vermont had only been a state for 2 years. So 3 years ago, Vermont had been a foreign country. So there hadn't been a huge amount of settlement in Vermont during that period after the Revolution, before it became a state. But in 1791 it becomes a state. If you live in Massachusetts, well, it's now another state, not a foreign country, and it's the frontier, there's opportunity, and this is a place to go. So the Taft family, I'll give you a little background. They came from England, settled in Uxbridge, Mendon, Massachusetts in the middle to late 1600s. So they've been around for a while. There are a ton of Tafts in the country now. It seems, at least early on, they had a very robust male lineage, and so every son had 8 sons who had 8 sons who had 8 sons, and there are tons of Tafts around now. So this Taft family, particularly we're talking about, there were 9 siblings. I think only 4 of them were male. And in 1793, a Stephen Taft, who was 26 years old, bought 200 acres here, sight unseen, I would imagine, and moved up with his sister Prudence. And when he got here, there was a log cabin down on Babcock Brook, half-mile that way. There was a log cabin up on what's now the Chandler property, maybe.
Do they actually know where that one was?
I haven't seen it on a map. So there were a couple log cabins. There was a farm, a mile up, Happy Valley Road, Sugar Hill Farm. That's pretty much all there was around here. So Stephen set out, and Stephen was a blacksmith by trade. His father was a carpenter in construction, and Stephen had learned blacksmithing, and that's what he came up to do, make a living at. So he had a river here, and back then hydropower was the way to go. If you need any sort of power, there is no steam power, obviously there are no gasoline engines, so water power was the easiest thing to harness. And he, the following year, so I'm sure the first year he built some crude, probably a log cabin to live in. In 1794, his brother Daniel, younger brother, who's 16 years old, follows and joins him up here to apprentice with him. And together they build, the first thing they need to do is harness the water power. So they build a crib dam, which looks like this is actually, can you all see that? This is as they were building the new dam, I think, and so the water's been drained. This is the back side, the side that would be facing us, and it was just in front of the current dam, maybe 50 feet, and not quite straight. And a crib dam was basically, you used what you had. You had logs they cut, they put in stakes, they put in logs, they filled the interior with rocks and then gravel and built that up until you had a dam. And then you would allow water to run on one side or the other, and that water in that chute, a chase, would turn the water wheel and provide you with power. So in this case, they actually had a chase on both ends. Because the next thing they did, after they harnessed the power, in 1795, they built a sawmill directly across on the other side of the river.
They built a what?
A sawmill. Right? And so now they were going to have sawn lumber, which means that everybody now can live in proper homes and not log cabins. They can build a proper house like they lived in down in Massachusetts. So that's the very first thing they did. That would have been 1794, 1795, after they had that built. On this side,
So is Luce's house? Isn't that Luce's? Is that an old farmhouse of that?
yeah, but that wasn't
that one.
that wasn't even a dream at that
Yeah.
point. Yeah, that was
But I
not.
figured it wasn't
yeah,
that old.
Nothing, no, nothing over there. They built a foundry on this side. So remember, Stephen is a blacksmith, and in that foundry, Daniel apprentices to him. Daniel also spent a lot of time, I think, running the sawmill while learning the blacksmith trade. And they made edge tools, which basically means anything with a sharp edge. His specialty was scythes, as in the old type of farming, right? And he made scythes. Eventually, the Tafts were making scythes of the highest quality, and they were sought after. They were being sold not just locally, but they were being sold out west, when out west was Ohio, right? But these were highly prized scythes. In 1796, another brother, Seth, comes up and joins them. And not long after him, a fourth brother, Benjamin, came up. And in total of the 9 siblings, 7 or 8, I think it's 8, ended up settling here. So almost that entire generation of Tafts
Gave up on
from
Massachusetts.
they gave it right. It was too crowded, too noisy. They came up here and settled. Also, so they have a sawmill on the far side. You've got to get across, and so besides, wading and getting wet, you'd want a bridge. So they, in 1793, right away, they put in a footbridge across the river. Now this is just for a person to walk across. This is not going to allow a horse to go across, or a wagon, or goods. It was simply a way, and it's kind of a rickety bridge. And these bridges, and so now I'm going to digress a little bit. These bridges, that one built in 1793, in 1807 gets washed. Actually, this one didn't just get washed away. The spring freshet took out the Elm Street Bridge in Woodstock it came all the way down the river till it got here and crashed. It took out the Taftsville footbridge, and both of them floated out to sea. So they rebuilt it in 1807. In 1811, out it goes. They rebuilt it. In 1826, gets washed away again. They rebuilt it. So they went through like 5 footbridges here, and they must have been getting very tired of replacing bridges.
What a big span.
So in 1802, Daniel and Seth kind of partner up together, and they buy 2/3 of the rights to the furnace, and I think 2/3 of the water rights, so they can operate as their own business. And at this point, so it's been about 10 years. The original Taft, Stephen, is now 35 years old. There's something going on with his health. I'm not sure what, but there's something going on, because he's 35 and he's already basically selling off this business that he has built up. And in 1804, 2 years later, Seth and Daniel buy the remaining water rights and the rights to the foundry and the sawmill. They pay $260, and yeah, and Stephen packs up with his wife. He leaves Taftsville. They move up to Barnard, which is where his wife's family were from. This is 1804, and by 1810, he's no longer with us, because of the census at that time shows his wife as head of household. So I don't, there was something going on with his health, and I don't know what it was, but he would have been in his 40s. I guess not unusual back then. I think back then, if you were healthy, you spent a lot of your time worrying about getting sick, right? Because that happened, and there were no antibiotics and nothing like that. So now Daniel and Seth are co-owners of the business, and that goes on for 7 years until 1811. And in 1811, there's a fire in the foundry. And in putting it out, Seth is injured. He has a head wound from a piece of metal. I'm assuming maybe something exploded. And they're working with iron back then, not steel. And you know what happens to iron? It rusts. And you know what happens if you step on a rusty nail? You get, yeah, back then they called it lockjaw. And there were no tetanus shots back then. So he receives this injury to his head, and he gets lockjaw. And it takes him, and it's not a good way to go, and it takes him almost 2 weeks to die. Seth dies. He leaves a widow. He has 2 children. He's already had one pass away. His wife is 7 months pregnant. I have no idea what happened to her. She disappears, and I've looked on Ancestry.com, and you're trying to see. You would assume she remarried. I mean, that's what she did back then. But she disappears off the rolls in Taftsville. I know their house was up on the hill, up where Apple Butter Inn is. Their house was up there somewhere. It was wood frame. It doesn't exist anymore. So now in 1811, Daniel is it. He's the only guy left, the only Taft running things. He still has a brother, Benjamin, working for him, but Daniel owns everything. He buys out the widow, buys out Stephen or Seth's interest in the business, and he's now going to go it on his own.
And he's the only mill here.
That's it. Yeah, back then, I mean, there are a few families, but it's pretty much, this is a Taft enclave in 1800. and they're pretty much able to work the business on their own. That's going to change. That's going to change, and that's actually going to start. It's going to begin after that fire, because Daniel consolidates. As I said, he buys the remaining water rights from Seth's wife. He rebuilds and he enlarges the foundry. And now we're going to walk up top. Before we go, I'm going to jump out of the 19th century and into the 20th briefly, because we're down here to talk about electricity. And running the store, I don't know how many times I had somebody, usually a tourist, say, what were they thinking when they built this erector set right in the middle of this 18th century mill town pond and covered bridge and all that. And I mean, I thought the same way. I understand now. The first powerhouse was built right here. It was a little red one.
What was that?
Wood frame. That was in 1893, and that was by the Woodstock Electric Company. And they ran a line from here, from Taftsville, down into Woodstock. And so Taftsville turned on the first lights in Woodstock in September of 1893. And back then there was they used gas for lighting, very dangerous. The town fathers in Woodstock, so the Woodstock Electric Company was trying to sell the town on, we'll bring you all your power. Well, the select board was skeptical. I think they were also good Yankees, and they wanted some proof that this newfangled electricity would really work. So they negotiated and said, well, tell you what, why don't you put in 20 street lights and power those things up and let us see how it works. So the Woodstock Electric Company put in street lighting. Town father said, yeah, okay, we got free street lights and this looks pretty good, so we'll let you run electricity into town. So that was the start of electricity here. This powerhouse was built in 1911. It was, and then there are actually 3 erector sets, one here, and one on the far side. They serve, one is for local distribution, one is for ties into the high tension lines, the grid, and the other one, I can't remember what the other one does. And if you think back, so this first tower, this one here, was built in 1927, and that brought electricity to the people that lived here. So if you lived here in 1927 and you had never had electricity, and all of a sudden this is going to bring you electricity, you would have stood out there and said, wow, progress. Right? This would have been a beautiful thing. Right? And nowadays we look and we say, God, what were they thinking? Couldn't they put us, well, they just weren't thinking that way. And I see a lot of similarities with the kind of overzealous commercial solar development. And we had a wrestling match with one developer, behind the cemetery, and it's a good thing. And people, they look at it and they go, progress. And whenever I see one of these big fields right off that's an eyesore, I think in 30 years, people are going to be looking at that going, what were they thinking? What were they thinking? Couldn't they have found a better place? Well, it was the same thing back then.
Was the railway right there, Keith? It must have been, wasn't it?
Okay, let's stay out
Where
of...
was the railway?
Let's stay out of date.
On the other side.
Let's stay out of date.
I mean, so while we're here, I figure it must have run somewhere right here.
It ran the railway.
How to be on this side? Yeah, going to Woodstock.
That's a picture of the train station. We are standing on the train station right here. Okay, there are the tracks. The tracks.
You there, Charlie, and that's it?
Is that me? No, I think that's Mildred. So the tracks ran right through here. And this was the platform. The station was right here. So the train came in 1876, five. And I don't want to go into a whole lot about, building Woodstock Railway, Frederick Billings. So he was able to get his prize. He was had been president of Northern Pacific Railroad. Wow, look at that. This allowed him to get his personal train car from New York, all the way to Woodstock, and then he had a short ride home. And the train lasted until the 30s, 33, before it went out of business. And the building that was here, the train station, served as the post office, which had started in the Taft House, went into the store, then came into the train station in the 1870s. And when the train closed down, it moved back into the store. The station also was a freight office, a ticket office. There was a grocery store there for a while. So it served a lot of purposes.
Charlie,
Yes,
here's part of the...
those steps were there. Yeah, I think they took you up. I think this is the platform down here. The station is up here, I think.
This brick building, you said was home.
1911?
So is that maybe Taftsville bricks?
No.
Where was that?
The Spalding Brickyard was way up at the top of kind of where Sugar Hill Road and Happy Valley Road
On the upper
come
side?
together on the upper
On
side.
the upper side? I was wondering where that
That's
was.
a picture of it. The Spalding Brickyard. This is the most famous. Everyone knows about the Spalding Brickyard. I can tell you right now that you will not see a Spalding brick here because Taftsville was done by the time this started. This started in the 1870s. Taftsville, 1870.
So maybe those bricks aren't
Taftsville,
there during the income.
Taftsville was already built. It was done.
Where was the picture?
For these bricks,
No, for the, when they rebuilding.
when they were building, that's a good question. Brickyards were not uncommon. If a farmer had some clay soil, and I know, my property, and then part of that is that lower field right next to the brook. So I was looking, and behind that is Chandler's property. I was looking at the deed to that lower lot, because that was sold separately in the 1850s. And when it's describing the boundaries of the lot, the back side against Chandler's property, it says, oak tree, this, and the brickyard. So there was a brickyard right there, which very likely furnished the bricks for Taftsville.
We have a brick that says inscribed with Taftsville on it.
Yeah,
You got it from the
Bob,
Fraziers.
Bob, yeah.
Bob Frazier.
Mary.
It doesn't say Spalding, because I think
Doesn't say
Spalding did
Spalding.
that too. It says just says Taftsville.
This is Taftsville.
So I don't know. If you think a farmer probably wasn't likely to have a fancy
He's not gonna
logo,
stand
and
it, no.
yeah, he's not gonna. He's got more important things to do, and so I don't know. I mean, my guess is it would either be
Somebody
Spalding,
was
but I don't know.
pointing out some print. Okay,
Okay, yeah.
I never noticed.
Yeah.
until this person pointed it
Let's
out.
let's move
Okay.
on. So we did railroad, we did.
Yeah, after this.
How are you? Well, good. See you here.
And you?
That's where I grew up. That was your house? Yep. Beautiful.
Understand a Spalding brick brick is pretty soft material too. It isn't that hard.
Oh, I've never heard that. Different type of clay undoubtedly. Like,
And probably a different type of systems that
manufacture it.
Okay. So that was business down there, and this is where the Tafts lived. And the original Daniel, now on, it's really, so Daniel, Stephen is left, died, Seth killed after the accident in the foundry, and Daniel, Daniel is it. Daniel is the man. And he builds his original house where that garage, this house is, right there. It was a wood frame built in the 1790s. And he has three sons. He has Daniel Jr., Owen, and Paschal. And by the 1820s, they've grown up, and Daniel is looking for, and they join him in the business. And so now Daniel needs to feed 4 families. So the business does. So he's got to expand this business. All of them live here. This is Daniel Jr.'s house right here, this magnificent Federal. This was built in 1826. When this was built, Daniel Sr. is still alive and very active in the business. His house is basically attached to it. And unfortunately, it was allowed to fall into disrepair and back. I don't know if any of you were around, probably not. I think it was the 50s or 60s or 70s. It got torn down and that new garage built, so it doesn't exist anymore. So that's Daniel Jr., oldest son, 1826. This, which we call the Pillars, for obvious reasons. This was Owen's house, Owen Taft. This was built in 1834. And the youngest son, Paschal, his house was not this one that you see, but the next one over.
Larry's house.
Yes.
Pasha?
Paschal, P-A-S-C-H-A-L. You could say Pascal, but that would be spelled
Yeah, that's early 1800s.
1834. Yeah, and it's a kind of a simple. It's wood frame, not brick. So Daniel's looking for a way to jumpstart this business. So he sees, so remember the roads, there was no Quechee Gorge Bridge. So travel between towns here was different than it is today. And from here, from this side of the river, the main road, Route 4 out there did not exist. That came in the 1850s. And so we're talking early 1800s. The main road was the Woodstock-Windsor Turnpike. This was it. When I bought the store, I always wondered why would they build it 100 feet from the main road? Well, the fact of the matter is when they built it, it was right on the main road, just that the main road moved. Okay, so the Woodstock-Windsor Turnpike ran from Woodstock. Butternut Lane used to go up and over. And if any of you are familiar with the Frady's farm, his drive that comes down, that was the discontinued part of it. And it continued down, it curved around and pretty much followed Stunk Hollow Road, Route 12, and went down to Windsor. So if you wanted to go that side of the river north, anything to the north, you had to cross either in Woodstock or, God, I guess you'd have to go down to Windsor and cross. So
The ferry was part.
So Daniel has this idea, and okay. Meanwhile, they've replaced their 5th footbridge there. Right? He petitions the state to build a permanent bridge here that'll carry heavy traffic. And in 1834, the state approves it, and they tell the 4 towns that they'll share responsibility. So Woodstock, Pomfret, Hartford all have different shares of ownership, which means responsibility in maintaining it. And so in 1834 it's approved. Knowing that, Daniel in 1834, so in Woodstock, the stone building next to Pye that burned down, right? That had been a foundry. It had a blast furnace in it. It was being converted into a linseed oil factory. So they had a blast furnace for sale. So Daniel went down and bought it. And I don't know how, but somehow they moved that blast furnace up here.
Oxen.
I guess. And I assume in pieces. And they built a building basically to house it in.
Wow.
So this is the building. Can you all see? This is the building from the street side. It's 2-story. This is it from the riverside. Look at the size of that. It's 3 stories on the riverside.
Here's the train station.
There's the train station. There's the power.
Here's the sawmill.
Sawmill, yes. Yep. Yep.
That's a great picture.
Yeah. So this is the back side of that building.
No,
There's a lot of development by that time.
Well, this is 1910. This picture. This is not. Yeah, this is already defunct. So, 1834, he gets all set. He's got a big blast furnace. He's not just going to do edge tools. I mean, now he can do. They've got molds. They can do agricultural implements. They can do tools. They do boot jacks. They do stoves.
Where are they getting the ore from?
The train. The train brings it
too
to
early.
right there, right?
The ore they were.
Or is that too early?
I'm not sure where all of it came from. A lot of what they used was called pig iron, and it probably there was a source down there where the where that golf thing is. Now there's wetlands there, and you can spot where that is because the water will turn rust color, and it tells you that there's iron in the rock. So a lot of what they used was pig iron. You know, so where their exact sources were, I don't know. And you think about how heavy that stuff is,
Absolutely.
and lugging it around with ox-drawn or horse-drawn carts. You know, it must have been not easy. So you would want to source it as close as possible. You weren't, bringing it up from Boston, right? So in 1836, that bridge, as we know it and love it, gets built. And that's built by Solomon Emmons. Solomon Emmons III, when the Tafts came here in 1793, Solomon Emmons, the original Solomon, was in one of those log cabins, the one that was up here. Might have been on on Van Chandler's property. So this bridge now opens up any market that you would have on the far side of the river. The Tafts are no longer limited to having to go to Woodstock or down to Windsor. They can, because really this was a main road, river road, that went through Quechee to Hartford Village, and then points north. So this, I think Daniel was very clever in negotiating for that bridge, getting the state to approve it, and then knowing it's going to happen, he expanded his business, and then Taftsville exploded. Before then, it was still pretty much a Taft family and a few other people, and I can give you a really good example of this. If we look at what exists today, you look for pre-1830 homes. There are 3 of them. This is one of them right here. So there are 3 built before 1830. In the 1830s, 5 are built. And most of those, this was 1834, but he already knows there's a bridge coming. And most of them are later part of 1830s. In the 1840s, 15 houses. 1850s, 5 more. So in the space of really 20 years, from 1835 to 1855, about 2/3 of the homes in Taftsville were built, all in that 20-year period. So there was this huge explosion because they needed workers. And they were using Daniel Sr.'s house here that was attached as lodging for an extra, 15 or 20 workers who had rooms there and took their meals there but didn't own property. And I know the house I live in, which is just the other side of the brook, was built in 1840. It's called the Joseph Weed House. Joseph Weed worked for the Tafts. So he came here, and it was actually, the house was built by the Tafts. They started doing some side business construction. Developers. I think of that as a spec house. They sort of build it and while you're here working for us, I've got a house I want to show you, right? So
our house down here was 39.
1839. So you're one of the very early ones then.
We're 37.
Okay. Huh?
We're 37.
37. Well, those are 3 of the 5 then. All right. So, and then, we've got 28 homes built by then, and then things really slowed down. So 1860s, 3 homes are built. 1870s, 2 homes are built. And in the next 140 years, 4 homes are built. Right? So you think about that 25 of them in that 20-year period.
And then the Civil War came.
And then Civil War. This was, or Taftsville became, an industrial, a mill town. This was not a sleepy, quiet little residential hamlet, right? This was a noisy, busy, probably smelly, dirty place. and it was a company town. I mean, it was really the Tafts. You know, they were building the houses and selling it to the workers. And then I guess it didn't take them that long. They said, God, we got this captive audience and we're paying them. Might as well take the money back. So they built the store in 1840. And the Tafts owned it. They were much too important and too busy to run it, so they would have hired a manager. I know when I bought the store, I always wondered, it was so odd that you have the main door in the center, but then there's another door on the far left in the front. But when I got inside and started demolishing, tearing stuff off walls, on that far wall, I could see the outline of a staircase. So that was actually, that far door was the entrance for the manager to go up to his apartment up above. So this was run basically to sell goods to the people that bought houses from you and worked for you, right? And they may have sold some of their products too. I don't know. It probably wasn't that important to them. You didn't have people driving by. And Route 4, one of the main reasons that was put in was because this road here, it was very straight, but to be straight it had to go uphill and then downhill. And you can imagine that would be fine for somebody on horseback, or I suppose if you're fit walking. But if you're a horse pulling a heavy wagon load, not so good. And in the winter, forget it. So in the 1850s, they decided to run this stretch, make this loop here of Route 4 closer to the river, and that kept it flat. And I don't know the exact date. I do know the Tafts, when they sold everything off, and the foundry was sold, the deed describing the property boundary on this side refers to Route 4 as the New Road.
What year was that?
1857. So how long would you call it the New Road? I don't know. 10 years? Could be, you know. So, but I'm guessing it was probably in the earlier 1850s. So they still called that the New Road, and this would have been the old road. There was, before we go farther up, the Tafts, Daniels is old enough by 1857. They decide to divest themselves of the business. They keep their homes, and they take all the property they own, and they've been selling off, bits as they build houses, or they sell lots and people build houses and then work for them. They took everything else they owned. The store became a lot. The foundry became a separate lot. The sawmill became a lot, and they auctioned them off. And in 1857, Taftsville ceased to be a company town. And it's interesting, before then, I mean, nobody competed with the Tafts, right? I mean, if you were going to own a business, your last name better be Taft. After that, so in the 1860s, a lot of other businesses sprang up, and there was a Hathaway. They put a dam a little farther down, a couple hundred yards downstream of the bridge, and they had I think they had a sawmill, they had a cider press, and then on Butternut Lane, let me just, those of you that live on Butternut Lane, think it's a nice, quiet, peaceful little place, right? Happy Valley Brook. You can see the bridge. All right. On this side is a carrier, a horse shoer.
On this side?
Mildred's house. The Whitney house. The Westphalen house was a blacksmith shop.
Yes, so we found metal things.
Okay. So that was blacksmith. The young Brulot, the house you see facing us, that was another blacksmith shop. And then right along the river here, there is a tannery. Imagine, there was a tannery, and then behind that, along the river, was a hull corn. What you used to make hominy, to shell the corn. So there was a hull corn. It's like a grist mill, but it was special. Wasn't making flour, it was making hominy. It was making hull corn.
What about DJ's? That's old.
1834. Yep, that was 1834. I think that was just a farm. Just a farmhouse. Okay.
Wasn't there another business where the guy who took all the dead animals and rendered them?
Up there.
Much later and up there, yeah.
That was later.
Oh, much later. Yeah, yeah, Psy. That's within our lifetime.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Nice.
yeah,
I didn't know that.
yeah. Yeah. All right, let's head on out.
Yes. We're down in Smoke Hollow.
I was this section.
Smoke Hollow back Same place. You play anymore? A little bit? Oh yeah, I saw that.
So you looked at that before, but I mean that's what Taftsville grew into, and pretty much in 20 years, for the most part.
The hillside.
Incredible. Yeah.
Remember, sheep.
Sort of an aside, Taftsville has always had a strong music tradition. I don't know why, but the number of people that live here that are musicians, and a number of them very accomplished musicians, and David's one of them, and Michael plays a mean piano, and I don't play a mean guitar, but they're a tremendous amount of musicians, and this is actually the Taftsville band back in the, I think this is an 1890s photograph.
Looks like the band that went across the bridge when we reopened it.
Isn't that
We
fun?
should start another.
Daniel Jr. played the violin and something else. Just want to make sure I didn't miss something. All right. And as we walk up, I'm going to talk about schools. The schooling was very important, even back then when you had children around, and these families tended to have a lot of children. The first schoolhouse was built around 1800. So there would have been Taft children back then. Keep going.
Barney, you need to move your car. I know.
You selling those, or did you steal those, or what?
Well, I stole them. Now I'm gonna
Okay, good. I like the way you think.
These are coming down fast, aren't they?
So the first schoolhouse was a little one room. I guess there wouldn't have been a huge number of students. But you want to educate them during the winter when there wasn't much to do on the farm, and then of course in summers they'd be let go. And the first schoolhouse was right back on this knoll right here. And it, unfortunately, so in 1811, it burned down. It was 2 weeks. There was 2 weeks of school left. The kids probably weren't unhappy. So Daniel, or the Tafts, built a second schoolhouse, same site, this time out of brick, and it was there for 30 years, and then was torn down when they moved to another location.
You know how many students it served?
I don't. It's one room, so.
Okay, it couldn't have been very big.
No,
because-
but you think this is before the explosion in. So they tore it down in 18. It says 30 years, so 1841. Well, 1836. You know, all the houses are starting to build. By the 1840s, Daniel decides, or 1850s, Daniel decides they need a 2-room schoolhouse. So I mean, that speaks to the size of the population and the amount of kids. And it is. Yeah. 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 I think it was. And I actually. December 10th, I think. Raymond Frank, for you?
There.
Here.
Charlie, you were just talking about musicians for Scott Hastings. Lived in the house down
Yes.
there with the bagpipes.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting to me that they're just, I mean, they're musicians, just, I mean, up and down, just, Tim Travers.
The current generation, a lot of the kids.
And the kids, yes, yeah, who've gone out and are professional, making
Yeah.
a living. Yes, it's really
really is
just stunning to me that
Yeah.
there's something in the
So
water,
much
or I don't know, but
Yes,
yeah.
me in the water.
Yeah, here, let's let people get by. So Daniel, so in the 1840s, I'm guessing 1841, builds a new schoolhouse here. Not what we're looking at, it was brick. By now the Tafts are really into brick. And this is a larger 2-room schoolhouse with a belfry. And the Tafts, as an aside, they love building in brick, and almost anything you see that's brick in Taftsville was built by the Tafts. Not everything, but almost everything. So this, and when this was done, some of you may not know, but back in 1850, you were standing in Heartland. Okay, this is Woodstock. That's Heartland. When I bought the store, I went into the town. I was looking for records on the store, and I couldn't find anything. What the hell is this? Well, I finally figured out it wasn't built in Woodstock. It was built in Heartland. So the records would be in Heartland.
When did that all change?
Well, so in 1851, the towns agreed, Woodstock and Heartland agreed to adjust their boundary. Probably the win part of it, Taftsville got, or Woodstock got land. Heartland got to wipe their hands of the covered bridge, and Woodstock had to take care of it. Right, so the boundary was shifted this way, and there's actually a stone post up in the hill here that kind of marks the point, and then it was a straight line down to the bridge. So it gets.
It didn't move very far, right?
No, so, you know, so here it's, yeah, for where you're here, it's less than 100 yards, right? When you get up there, it's farther, but it's not like a half mile. I mean, it's several hundred
The
yards.
farm that's behind the Apple Butter Inn is
Right,
partially
that's-
in Woodstock and partially
In Heartland, yeah. Yeah. So,
So Bev's in her.
yes, yes.
And Ellen.
Yeah.
So,
New Allen.
so in 1853, they're now towns are kind of unifying. They're making education a more formalized system than just having a community build a schoolhouse. So in 1853, Daniel deeded the land and the school here to the town. And it now became, it was now the town's responsibility. They ran the school. In 1911, the town voted to build a new schoolhouse, and that's what we're looking at, which was large enough for school assemblies, religious purposes, there are no churches here, or for any other use for the benefit and advancement of the community. Wasn't that nice of Woodstock to do that for Taftsville? So they built this new two-room schoolhouse. The Grange used it quite frequently for meetings and suppers. This actually became school district number 7 in Woodstock. All the schools in 1953 were consolidated. They continued to use this. I think they couldn't fit all the students, so they did 2 school years here up until 1957. And that was the last class in that building was in 1957. The Mennonites purchased the property in 1961, and it's been the Taftsville Chapel or the Mennonite Chapel ever since. And I'm going to end that's a nice segue into religion. I can talk about that a little bit here. As I said, there were no churches, but that's not that people weren't religious. And the Mennonites have been active in the area since 1947, since just after the war. Some of them came up as part of their war service as conscientious objectors, and they worked in the hospital in Hanover. They worked at some of the precision tool works, right, in Springfield and Windsor and whatever, to support the war effort. My understanding is these young lads went home after their service, which was in Pennsylvania, said, boy, there's this great area up in Vermont, the Upper Valley. We ought to think about colonizing it, and that's kind of the way they do it. The group, the congregation makes a decision, and I think they take volunteers. They don't order people, but whole families will move, and not just one, but a group. So when they arrive, they already have a small community. So the Mennonites have been active in this area since 1847. They ran a 2-week Bible school camp every summer for 70, 80 kids, and they would drive around, I mean, all over the communities around here, picking the kids up in the morning and then delivering them back home.
That thing
In
near
the
the
evening?
Wilder Cemetery, wasn't that Mennonite? There was something in the Valley News like within the last couple of years about it. Huge camp back behind on Taft's Flats. You never
Oh,
knew
really?
what was
I don't
back
know.
there.
I don't know.
I think that was Mennonite.
There's a camp that's still there.
Yeah.
And
You
that was
don't even realize it's back there.
and that was Mennonite.
I think so.
Yeah, it's at Van Kirsten now.
Near the dam there? Above the dam?
It's right behind the cemetery. That's on the-
Like behind that.
Oh, yeah,
behind it.
Okay.
So here the locals used the building. They ran Sunday school for kids. They'd have a prayer meeting on Sunday nights, and they would also bring in.
You left the door unlocked. I assume you're going in.
Yes, we're going to go in. I'll lock up.
We just mowed the lawn for you.
Thank you. Thank you. Looks good.
Come do ours.
So they would also import preachers to hold a service here, and they would so they bring in a preacher from Hartford or from the Congregational Church in Woodstock. They'd pay him $1, and they would not pass the collection plate. Yeah, that's all he got was $1. He wasn't getting any more. And if you think back then, and I'm talking early 1900s, there was a lot of evangelical, fire and brimstone type of kind of an intolerant religion. Certainly, temperance movement was very big, and so they would bring in or evangelists, Pentecostalists would come in and set up a tent meeting by the road, I think on the field that where Frady's mortgage used to be, right? On that field there, they would set up a big tent, and these fire and brimstone guys would come in and preach hell and damnation, and the people, they'd flock to it, they'd eat it up. Very well attended. Not everybody here was so religious, and I know there was one night when local boys in the middle of one of these impassioned speeches cut the ropes holding the tent up and dropped the whole tent on.
Was this in the 1950s or the 1800s?
This is early 1900s.
Okay.
There was another time in 1909 when an evangelist preacher in a tent out there was fired, delivering this fiery sermon, and at the end of it, he said, "Every member of my family except my grandmother has been converted, and she is going to hell." And at that, several young men got up, made a little noise with their chairs to leave, and he was very annoyed by that, so the preacher pointed to them and shouted, "And those young men are going to hell too." At which point one of the boys turned, looked back at the preacher and asked, "Any message for your grandmother?"
That's a good one.
So that about wraps it up. All right, we've got some cider and donuts in the church, in the chapel, and you're all free to go when you want.
Great, thank
All
you.
right?